Thank you so much, Nancy. I have just one question for our panelists, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience here. So across all three of your presentations, I picked up on the fact that in all the work that you do, some part of it, if not all of it, is deeply informed by the science of learning and development, whether it's context, relationships, dynamic systems, developmental systems. And I also heard pretty specifically a move away from a deficit mindset around our kids to an asset-based mindset. Now, neither of those things, being informed by the science of learning and development or asset-based mindsets, were part of the DNA of our system, so it's a really hopeful story. But none of that is permanent without a lot of hard work. I predict next year, 2020, is going to be one of those years that is written about for a long time in this country. I think it's going to be a watershed moment for us. So I'm wondering, from your perspective, where you sit, what do you think needs to be true next year and into the future to make sure we stay on this positive trajectory? How do we not slide back? That's a big picture question.
I'll start. So one thing, although we are focused on youth and youth assets and positive youth development, so for one, I will say adults have to start following youth, right? I mean, I think that young people have been at the forefront of social movements in this country and internationally for a long time, and it's time that we catch up. Number one, and listen, and follow. And number two, we have to start by changing our own attitudes, right? So one of the things that I sort of say a lot is, when our national narrative about adolescence in general, but middle school specifically, is a negative one, when what young people see is that when people say middle school, the adults go, oh, right? Or they hear the adults saying, oh God, I'm gonna have middle schoolers, right? Well, then what do we expect, right? Of course they're going into middle school thinking this is going to be a horrible experience, right? Because that's what they've been told by the adults around them. So I think we have to do a lot of work as a field to continue to change the narrative around adolescence and around middle school, and to really shine a light on the ways in which young people are already leading and already are being positive models.
Yeah, I would echo that. And I think it comes down to attitude and language. And I think it starts with how society, maybe I don't know where it starts, but society has a part in it, not looking at middle schoolers just in a negative, but promoting the positive on social media and just in general language. I think that's part of it. I think it comes to our training at the collegiate level. And I know when I taught, was an adjunct at a couple of universities, and I would teach middle level methods classes, I had to purposefully, mindfully think, like, I have to frame this like, okay, here are all of the issues that our middle schoolers are dealing with, but it's not a bad thing. Like, here's how we're gonna work with it. Here's how we're gonna make it fun. So I think it comes down to that, how you frame things. And then for teachers, how we frame things as well. Rather than saying, 20 more days till winter break, say only 20 more days to make a difference. Only 20 more days with you guys here until we have to leave for winter break. And I tried very hard to model that with my students, but I think it comes down to that really collectively thinking and making a conscious effort to be positive and look at the great things these middle schoolers are doing.
I would agree, and I think that really listening to middle schoolers, I think one of the things that we've started doing is it's a campaign called Oakland in the Middle, and we interview middle schoolers. We find out what's happening, what advice they have. What does this 8th grader have? What advice do they have for a 6th grader? What are they reading? Who are their favorite teachers and why? And just listening to them, because there's so much positivity that really does get taken away by how we think about middle school and how many people just cringe about middle school. And it's true, like, why, if that's what you feel about me, why should I behave differently? But I agree with what you're saying there.
That's so powerful. If we can attend to every young person's dynamic individuality and stop layering these mindsets and these notions on them, maybe they can teach us a lot about what we can do for them. With that said, anybody have any questions from the audience? All right, thank you.
Hi, my name is Bobby Milstein with Rethink Health and a member of the Roundtable. We've heard a lot today about the importance of context and relationships in various forms, and the two dominant ones are the contexts where age mates can connect with each other, and then contexts that allow adults and kids to relate to each other. I'm wondering if there's any attention to the way that middle schoolers relate to younger or much older kids. And I say that as the parent of a middle schooler who I have seen change when she's been in contexts where 13 to 17-year-olds are together, like in a theater program, or how she is with very young kids as a babysitter or, you know, in the neighborhood. And I'm just wondering if that's part of the educational sort of cosmos here in terms of cross-age relationships.
So oddly enough, that was actually some of my earliest research was actually in boys and girls clubs, and where there was a wide range of kids together. And one of the things that I saw when I was doing research in those spaces, and that I talked about the power of, was this sort of multi-level mentoring where you had younger kids, older kids, and adults, and the power of that, because what you saw was teenagers shifting their own view of themselves as they realized that they were being role models for younger kids. And you saw younger kids seeing near peer mentors and therefore being able to articulate their potential future selves just a few years down the line. And it was really powerful, right? And so I'm a big fan of that. I actually think we age segregate in our society way too much. I think we should be building far more opportunities for youth to interact across age, because I do think it has benefits for both, for both ends of the spectrum of those peer mentoring relationships. I will say with scaffolding, right? I think that the important thing is that you also then have adults who are there scaffolding. But yeah.
Hi, I'm Kathy Bozzi. I'm a member of the Roundtable and also from the Michigan Health Improvement Alliance. I was particularly intrigued by your parcel tax, and I was curious about a couple of things about when did that pass and how were you actually able to make the case for that tax? I mean, you talked a little bit about how it's managed and deployed and those kinds of things, but how it came to be in the first place.
So the parcel tax, due to, if anybody has paid attention to Oakland, we are in severe crisis, and we have been for the last, I'd say the last 12 years, are trying to recover from being financially, we're trying to gain our financial stability. And one of the things that we entered into is a time when we were still reducing money and middle school was being cut as we have to focus on huge cut, you know, the costs were growing. So I think that when the parcel tax was put together, it was put together after, there's another parcel tax that focuses on high school. It's called Measure N, and it's a similar parcel tax. They just have a little bit more of a nuance. It's not as, I tend to think that G1 is very focused on middle school electives and staff retention, whereas Measure N kind of is dealing with pathways, and there's a lot of flexibility. So I think the taxpayers were willing, and it passed by a small margin, I should say, that taxpayers were willing to invest in middle schools and realizing that we do need to provide music and art and those type of courses back to our middle school students. That is the one place where things were being cut. In elementary, you know, there are PTAs or different groups where they have, you know, the ability to have some music. Everybody in 5th grade takes band, but it kind of drops. So when you got to middle school, there was nothing left. So I think the idea that they were being, you know, that we were not making that investment in middle school, taxpayers gave us a chance to do that, and I think that that's why it's a really like it's a 1% administrative fee if you know it costs. All the money goes out to schools. It was passed in 2016, November 2016, and we started allocating money in 2017.
Hi, I'm Han Kao Yu, Chief Learning Officer with the California Endowment and a Roundtable member. Just want to thank all of the panelists today. I've gotten so much from your comments today, and I was particularly sitting with what you said earlier, Joaquin, in terms of, and I was thinking in the context of really creating equity, that we need to be thinking about not reformation, but transformation. Because I think that's what it takes in terms of really thinking the structural components. And then I was also thinking, Christopher, about your comment, how bold it was to think about 100% of kids feeling loved, challenged, and prepared in your school. I mean, that is really bold. And in our work in the 14 communities throughout California, we really emphasize agency, which is around the power of communities to really shape their destiny, around belonging, and how the narrative of exclusion has completely pushed away a lot of families who should be part of the school communities. And then the change conditions, which is about what I heard earlier about, it's not about beating the odds, but changing the odds. So it's the conditions in which people exist. So just along the topic of community voice and young people's voice, just curious because in our Del Norte work that we're doing, we've been doing empathy sparked human design thinking, where systems players go and do empathy interviews with the communities, and they reshape how schools are doing work. Teachers of 30 years are now changing practices. So just curious if you have any examples in which community and young people are really leading the way around how schools are being transformed, middle schools.
I think, so Broward County, I know I saw someone present on some of the data that was being collected at Broward County, not specific to the education system, but it was sort of one of the community-wide initiatives, and it was one of the only examples I had seen of youth participatory action research and youth voice being included in that data. I don't know if that's true with your middle school initiative also, but that was what came to my mind when I thought of it.
And I'm not sure if I'm mirroring what you're trying to refer to, but we had the data about the attendance behavior and course grades. Is that what you were thinking?
No, so this was at a different conference, a different presentation. Okay. Someone else from Broward County, I think, was talking about a community, a community-wide initiative that was collecting data, I think more around community indicators and health indicators, and they included youth participatory work and youth voice in that, and I didn't know if that was bleeding into what you're doing in the schools.
I will say I don't have any specific information about students leading a change at the school level, but I do know there are many instances of kids leading change as far as researching and then raising money, doing a good deed. I talked about Feed My Starving Children earlier. Our students this past year, the last school year, did a huge campaign for St. Baldrick's, which is an organization devoted to raising funds for pediatric cancer research. They raised over $400,000 for pediatric cancer research. Just put that in your brain. And so I think they do wonderful things in relation to helping others and bettering the community and bettering the world. But I wish I had an example for a school. So.
The only other thing I can think of, I'm not sure I don't think it's middle school, it's in general schools, but right now in New York City, right, there are students who are actively working on issues of segregation and in New York City public schools and are getting attention around this and getting that. So there are, I think, student movements to change issues of inequity that they see in their own school. I think the examples I've seen of that have been grassroots from students and not at the behest of the school systems, which is where there should be more coming from, I think.
And I'll just add and say, to the extent that I think sometimes we see these types of youth-led movements across the country and around the world, they're often in opposition to contexts which are not supportive of them taking agency and using their own motivation to make change, which in and of itself is a hopeful, invigorating story when you see things like that happening, but one has to ask themselves, what is possible if the context invited that kind of agency and motivation? Why do we have to set up kids to fight all the time to get what's better in their lives when we could say, well, show us the way. What are your ideas? And I think it's sometimes just as simple as asking them, and they'll let us know.
I actually want to share the work of a colleague at the University of Arizona, Julio Camarota, Cammarota. So you know him, all right? He's doing great work in terms of using youth participatory action research and with young people and informing curriculum. And then outside of the school setting, in Austin, Youth Rise is an organization that is working with young people impacted by parental removal due to incarceration or deportation. And my team has an open call for ideas, inviting people that are interested in testing their ideas about how to improve population health to come to us, and so we can work together, play together. And so their submission to our call for ideas led to the development of a youth-informed research agenda that the organization is going to take on. So I know more of the examples outside of middle schools than I know.
Well, with that, thanks so much to our panelists for helping us understand a little bit more about the big picture. It's been a pleasure, and thanks to everybody for joining us today. Thank you.
All right, well, that was another fantastic discussion. I think this has been such an interesting experience because people with just tremendous amounts of experience and expertise across different areas, all relating to the same topic, have had a chance to really listen to each other and engage. And I wanted just first, this is the last session where we're sort of a general conversation. I'm going to share just a couple thoughts, but first I wanted to see whether there's anybody here who is just bursting to talk about something on their mind given the various themes that have come up. That's hit me at certain times today, so I just want to give that opportunity for someone. Okay, Carla?
I have a lot of questions for a lot of you, but in particular to the first panel, I just wanted to know if in your budgets there's a discretionary funding item where you can be able to experiment and pilot different settings, like for example, Dr. Dodd's non-departmentalization of middle schoolers. Do you have that flexibility? And I think the parallel with public health is that they have a general budget, but a lot of it is itemized and it's strictly for one thing, and if it's grant-based, you can't go outside the parameters. And so the ability to have discretionary funding is really restrictive. So if any of you can share anything about that, and how do you know that what you're doing is working? Meaning, a lot of us talk about evaluation, and some evaluation is an afterthought. A lot of the times there's no money for evaluation. So in order to substantiate a grant, for example, or to ask for more money, how is it that you quantify that need other than letting it get to a crisis point that then you can use as a lever? Thank you.
Thanks, Carla, and thanks for everything you did for us. It's interesting, the inception of Project Success that I talked about earlier, it happened very naturally, and it's amazing as a school principal what you can get away with when no one's paying attention. I didn't ask permission to design or implement Project Success. It was a complete bottom-up initiative, innovation. I felt very strongly, while I certainly had something to do with it as the principal, it was a teacher-led innovation, and I probably didn't talk about that enough today, this was something that the teachers kind of took a leap of faith on. There were really no funding implications. I would just say that the only thing that in an indirect way would have cost money, extra money, was that we made sure all the Project Success teachers had an extra planning period. So they only taught 4 classes versus in a typical schedule it would be 5 classes. To bring that to scale would be challenging. You'd have to change your schedule. You'd have to get an agreement with a teachers union to make that happen. But really, on a small scale, we were able to do it, and it was cost neutral. And so I'm as far as bringing it to scale, yeah, I love this last panel and the discussion about the big picture of what's next for middle schools. I'm still struggling with how we bring initiatives like Project Success and have them accepted in a wider way when secondary educators are trained as secondary educators. And lots of times they teach the way, it was referenced before, what they experienced growing up. So all of those institutional structures are kind of patterns that we take for granted. And so how do we break those? How do we try new things? Again, I'll just say that I think the best way to do it is start with a teacher in a classroom in a school and hopefully have it spread.
Great. Phil?
Philip Alberti, Roundtable member and with the Association of American Medical Colleges. So I'm the dad of a toddler, so I now feel like super prepared for like 10 years, so thank you for that. But one of the things that struck me the most, and I mentioned it to you off to the side, we saw a bunch of 3-tiered models, right? So here's social work, I'm going to come in with my 3-tiered model, and here's restorative justice, I'm going to come in with my 3-tiered model, and here's public health, and we have our own 3-tiered model. So I don't have an answer for this, but what would it mean to have like a singular, comprehensive, parsimonious 3-tiered model? So all the sectors were coming together and really collaborating to think that through. So
yeah, I mean, just to build on that you're hitting Carla too, one of my points also, which is that people from different perspectives were talking about the same thing, and using different tools in some cases. What are the opportunities for collaboration in that? Collaboration could be both in terms of common measures, but also building models to address some of these issues. The floor is open for thoughts about that. Great.
That, okay. This isn't an answer to that, but maybe just a ray of hope. So I referenced the UVA Center to Redress Inequity through Community Engaged Scholarship. The faculty leads on that are a lawyer, an architect, a nurse, a doctor, myself, and who's a developmental scientist, and a professor who's joint appointed in psychology and public policy, right? We all work together and collaborate on lots of projects because we essentially all realized, we're all talking about the same things using different terms. Wouldn't our communities be benefited more if they had one central place, not all these different people coming at them? And so that's what we're trying to do at UVA with a general focus on equity. But I think one thing it does mean is that we all sit in a room together and it's like, okay, wait, when you say this, right, do you mean that? Like we're having conversations about what we mean, right? Even if we continue to use our individual terms when we're publishing in our individual literatures or working with our individual people, we're trying to build a shared language and terminology to get it. so that we can actually collaborate to address issues. So I think it is possible, but current structures tend not to be set up to make that really easy.
I don't know if the person from Alameda County is still here. Maybe she left. I thought that when she talked about the wellness centers that she had with the extra resources, that was a bit of an integration of health and education, maybe more than some of the individual specific things that were talked about. Just a quick couple things. In public health, we do think about measuring things, which is what Carla was talking about. And, I came away with some different thoughts about measurement. The concept of engagement was very interesting. That's not something, I think of kids in school as absenteeism being a really big one. But that there's such a thing as engagement that you can measure is very interesting. And also this sense of safety and sense of who you can turn to being really core to the educators here. I would have thought that if I had suggested that, the educators would have said, no, we're looking at test scores, but this idea of a sense of safety being really something you're trying to build in your school and you're proud that's one of your top outcomes gives a lot of overlap, I think, to think about what we're trying to do. And maybe just, I'll pose this question on measurement. How well are measures like that really accepted in the field for middle school? Is it just a couple great principals that'll get up and say, this really matters to me? Or is this something that the field of middle school really says, we're really trying to get to a point. We believe that these sort of core measures of well-being for kids are really going to produce better outcomes later, and we really want to measure these things for everybody. I don't know whether any of the people who know this field well could speak to, where you're really, can we see progress on these things? Is there data?
I don't know about the data, but I would say that, in my opinion, is what defines a middle school versus a junior high. If you are a middle school not in name, not just in name, but in practice, then you do put those relationships and the safety of your students and the connections they build first and forefront. But if your focus is on academics, top priority, I'm not sure you're a middle school. So I think that's my personal opinion of it. And I think it does depend school to school.
Yeah, but do people, are there national surveys? Is it, just like people look at their park scores, do they say, my kids, we're in the top tier of feeling safe and those sorts of things? Is there like a movement to even to go in that direction?
There definitely is a movement to move in that direction. I think it's district specific in terms of whether or not it's embraced. So I'm fortunate enough to work in a district where we really do care about, that's one of our district's goals, about students feeling loved, challenged, and prepared. So we use the Panorama survey, which is a nationally recognized and research-based survey to really get that data from students. There's also the Tripod survey that came out of the Harvard Graduate School of Education, some other groups too, that assesses students, they call them the 7 Cs, different connections to the school and different facets of it. But at the end of the day, we get held accountable pretty quickly. And it's usually generally in all school districts, it's going to be on academic measures and reading and math, whatever that happens to be in your state. We're often under the gun to make sure enrollment is right, because more kids means more funding for your school and more that you can do things. So if you work in a narrow-minded district or a municipality, sometimes we aren't afforded the luxury to really dive into and care about the issues that we know really matter. But I think there's a moving trend systematically to start to at least appeal to those numbers.
Yeah, I think, partly we think about what projects come out of meetings like this, but I definitely have something in my mind around measurement of some of these issues, because some of those things could be helpful in clinics and at the public health level. You could be measuring them too, and you could say, well, is there something that others can do to be helpful to kids' sense of security, for example? There's a project that hopefully will be started soon in Washington, D.C. with some pilot schools. I don't know if it's yours, to share absenteeism data with the pediatrician. but it's sort of a variation on that. If others are aligned to similar measures, is that a way to get people to talk and work together closely? Wookie?
Just a couple notes on measurement. I'm not a researcher or a very competent measurer either. But that said, what we do know about the state of education research is that lots of our measures were predicated on notions that are outdated and outmoded, and with implicit bias and structures built into the algorithms of the math itself, right? And so the idea that there is no average learner really is really hard to wrap your head around it when measures and methods are employed that use a fit line and then identify at particular moments how far someone deviates from that line. And so the Science of Learning and Development Alliance, a team led by Rich Lerner at Tufts University, has just launched a revolutionary project this year called the Methods and Measures Across the Developmental Continuum, and it is going to attempt to, and the early results are promising, attempt to track and measure the real jaggedness in any one young person's development across a number of dimensions, right? So at any point in time, any young person is strong in one area and is weak in another area, and that does not, align to anybody else's trajectory. And so we have to develop these new measures, actually, I think, to begin to develop this new narrative for folks about what is and what is not true when it comes to our kids. So I think measures and data are really important, but we have to, take it with a caution that the lenses that we've come to understand the world currently are likely flawed.
Right. Okay, good point. I want to, Alina, please.
A quick question about measures, too. A lot of us in public health, I think, have been hearing a lot about absenteeism, fourth grade reading proficiency.
Third, yes.
And, I thought so, too.
Yeah.
So if you look at the Healthy People 2030 objectives, they have fourth grade in there. So I was a little confused by that. But there's that, and then there's also kindergarten readiness. So I was surprised not to hear much about any of those today. So I was just curious what thoughts people had about the appropriateness of those measures to be taken up by health folks for measuring the social determinants of health. Thank you.
Or for contributing to educational success, right? I mean, that's the purpose. If you've got, I think as a pediatrician, if you were to say, tell me one thing about a child and I'll tell you how well they're doing, it's how they're doing in school. It's not any, probably anything related to their growth curve. So trying to figure out how the health system, public health system can support what's absolutely essential to their health is a big concern to people who are thinking how health can be improved, and we've been really talking a lot about those three measures. So I think it's a good question for Melina whether those resonate or not. Tina, do you have a thought on that?
I think it's interesting because there's a National Academy Children's Forum, and they are putting together the vital signs for child health. There's a whole vital signs effort through the National Academy of Medicine and a lot of the usual measures, but the Children's Forum is actually focusing on three things, and you just mentioned what they were, and was going to be writing actually perspective pieces on those three. So I think health is thinking that way.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Johanna Rosenthal. I work with Cardia, and we're based in Oakland. We have offices in Seattle and Austin, Texas. And one of our big efforts for quite a few years, but certainly since the California Healthy Youth Act was passed in January 2016, is to support districts in California with implementing comprehensive sexuality education. And so our big effort, when you talk about measures, because the California Healthy Youth Act was AB 329, includes mandates to provide an inclusive, safe learning environment. I think that more of those kinds of measures have been included, it's particularly in California, with a focus on that. And also the California Healthy Kids Survey asks many of those kinds of questions. So I think because now it's this legal mandate that districts and areas in California are definitely focusing on those kinds of measures that much more.
Good. All right. Well, that's great. I want to switch a little from measures. Unless you have a final thought on measures.
I have a final thought on
Okay.
measures, just another set of measures that are out there. So the Search Institute, which is a institute out of Minneapolis, so they have they have a model around assets and individual assets and ecological assets. So what are the assets that individual youth have, and then what are the assets in youth communities and settings? And they have measures around assets, right? So you can look at how many assets does a kid have in the contexts in which they're developing. And they also have measures, they're in the process of validating their measures of developmental relationships, which is looking at, how much kids have these kind of positive, supportive relationships in their lives. And so those are measures that are used a lot by in comprehensive community initiatives and things like that.
Great. Well, if anybody's here inspired based on this discussion and measurements to work with us on a little project, maybe a paper for the National Academies, please come up to me or Alina or Carla after, and we'd be happy to work with you. The other point I think that was clearly a common theme is to see early adolescence in the middle school years as an opportunity, kind of echoing the adolescence report of the National Academies, today's discussion kind of, I thought, hit that at different levels. Like, even when a kid is throwing a fit, there's an opportunity to engage them in a way that's much more productive. And when we think about middle school and our kind of conception of middle school, there's a way to rethink middle school so you get much better results. So I think, that is a hard message. And I just wanted to open up if anybody has ideas as we're talking about it, as we're kind of going forward in our different fields. What are the key messages that are the most helpful to get people to see middle school as more of an opportunity than just something to kind of endure?
I'm actually going to share something that one of my 8th graders told me recently. Our CEO for AMLE came in, did a little interview with some of my students, and so it's kind of what you said, but I'm tweaking it a little bit because I just want to share what she told you guys,
sure.
what she told us. So we asked her, what do you want your teachers to know about you and about your classmates? And she said, we're not 3 and we're not 30. We're not kids and we're not adults. We're middle schoolers. And this is, an 8th grader. I just sat back in my chair and I was like, well, there you go. That's it. And I think that's what we all need to just keep in mind, is that they are unique. And they have really profound thoughts, and they have really amazing ideas. We just need to remember, they're not 3 and they're not 30.
And
They're
you're also
middle
making the
schoolers.
point that their voice may make that case
Yes.
better than anybody else. Yeah.
So this is my mom hat now, because I have an 11-year-old who's in 5th grade, and next year will be at Edna Brewer. And he couldn't be more excited about going to middle school. He sees it as an opportunity for growth for himself. He sees it as the ability to get up in the classroom and put his art supplies away without waiting in line to put them away. He said, I can't wait till I can just do things more on my own and not have to stand in line till everybody's quiet before we're released to recess, but we are expected to take more responsibility for ourselves. And so I think that's another way of framing it, is that you get to do these things. You get to have different classes. You get to have different teachers, because, in elementary school, if you don't like your teacher, you're stuck with that one teacher. You get to explore all kinds of things. You get to go to school with students from other schools, because he's excited about making new friends than the ones that he's been in school with K through 5. So I think there's a way of making it very positive. And shout out for Edna Brewer, because every single student who I've ever talked to who goes there for the last few years loves it and loves middle school because of Edna Brewer.
Yeah, well, I'm a frequent judger of middle school science fairs and National History Days in Baltimore City, and I love doing it. And so my answer to this is to tell stories about the kids that I have seen. And my favorite science fair project was a young girl who asked one question to everyone in her K-8, one question: are you embarrassed by your parents? And she separated out boys and girls, and she did a beautiful curve for boys and a beautiful curve for girls, showing that girls became embarrassed by their parents a year before boys. And by 8th grade, everyone, it was like 80% embarrassed by their parents. It just went up perfectly, and I was like a great thing. And I said to her, But at least Isaac wasn't embarrassed by his parents. This is when my son was still at the school, right? And she said, I don't think it's appropriate for me to tell you how he answered that question. So she got an A for ethics, she got an A for science. It was very good. Joaquin.
On the topic of messages, I think words are so important because words lead to mindsets and mindsets lead to behaviors. But the challenge for those of us in this field and educators and researchers is that we sometimes use too many words. And so messages need to be short, pithy, they need to connect with the visceral sort of feelings that our parents and our community stakeholders have. But I'll just reference the slide that I had in my presentation. Every young person has potential, period. Every young person has potential. The science backs that up. There is no average learner, period. There's no such thing. It's a myth, right? And so we have to constantly use these messages and reinforce them and let our kids know, with a caveat that in this hyper-individualistic society that we live in, we can not attend to the power that collectivism and collectivist cultures and group formation have in our identity and our eventual mindsets and behaviors. But I think it's super important to know what the Academy is saying now about the nature of adolescent and youth development and learning, that in every person, in every young person, there is talent in everyone. Talent is not scarce. It is in every single one of our kids. That doesn't mean that every kid's an Einstein, but that's also a fallacy of thought in terms of, well, no, we all can't be this one individual person, right? But everybody can discover his or their or her unique talent in life, their own fulfillment in life, and I think those simple messages are what's going to penetrate a really tough American mindset.
Great. Well, I appreciated you're not trying to beat the odds, you're trying to change the odds. I thought that was a good one, too. I think in the end, this has been a great space because what we need is both space and also the resources to figure out how to work together and change the model for middle school students. And this has been a great conversation to do that. I want to give any last comments for anyone reflecting on today. Lourdes? Oh. Sorry.
So this is because, proceedings, right? So I want to
Right, this will all be, that's a good point. Just to point this out, I'll go back. You might have missed it when I said at the beginning, today's going to turn into a little book, and you'll all get a copy. So
Yes.
Lourdes is speaking to history, not just to us in the room.
Yes,
Okay.
exactly, right? So I want to elevate a comment that Marianne, who I think left already, and Tabiti made about social-emotional, adding the last S to STEM, right? So now it's not just STEM, it's STEAMs, right? It's science, engineering, science, technology, and engineering, art, math, and social-emotional skills. So thinking about in the same way that we have these expectations of achievement in technical areas, have and meetings and developing those skills as something that can be learned, that we start thinking about what would it look like if we have an emphasis on STEAMs instead of just STEM.
Great. Gary.
Just a comment to, I'm picking up on that we're recording for history here.
Yes.
One of the themes that was so powerful today was the deproblematizing of these middle years. That's very consistent with themes that we're picking up in other workshops. That health is a domain of opportunity and growth, often distinctive in terms of the phase of someone's journey, but it's the positive nature of these driving forces in the human experience that the health field has articulated very poorly. And so I heard that all over today, and we're going to hear it in other workshops. So enormous thanks to every one of the presenters, just blew me away. So thank you.
Great. Excellent. Our workshop is not over until Gary Gunderson speaks, so I appreciate that. And with that, I think we're done, and we really appreciate your all coming today.